Hello, welcome. I'm with Christina Lamb today. She's a British author and journalist. She's written 9 books and she's won many journalism and book awards. And Christina is one of our finalists for the Witold Pilecki International Book Award. And she's in the category of the Special Prize for War Correspondents for her book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you.
I'm so looking forward to talking to you about this book because I've read it. I think it's fantastic, and if people haven't read it and haven't got a copy, they should go out and buy themselves one because it is life-changing, I think.
I'm
personally.
glad you think that.
But let's start with a few questions in general, and then we'll get into a little bit about the nitty-gritty of the book. So first of all, what inspired you to write this book?
So I wrote this book because I was angry. I was angry because my work, as you said, is mostly as a war correspondent. And I've been doing it for more than 30 years. And I guess being a woman, I've always spoken much more to the women in war. I personally think it's much more interesting, the people trying to keep their lives together during conflict and kind of feeding, educating children, protecting the elderly, than the actual, what we call the bang bang. So because of that, and I think that those are the real heroes of war, but there's also a dark side, and that is the use of brutality, sexual brutality in particular, against women. And I have to say that in the last 7 years, I would say, I have seen more use of rape against women and girls than at any time in my career, which I found rather baffling and disturbing. And so that's what set me on the path of looking at this issue.
So what is new in this book and what makes it so unique in itself?
So, I mean, I have to say, I didn't actually set out to write a book. I just was trying to understand why this was happening so much. So at the beginning, I mean, what really first disturbed me was meeting a group of women on a Greek island called Leros during the refugee crisis in 2015. And they were Yazidis. And we met in the ruins of this asylum. It was a very eerie place. And I didn't know what happened to them, but I could just tell that something truly terrible had happened. It was like all the light had gone out of their eyes. And also they just didn't seem connected to what was happening around, like their children were almost falling down holes in this ruined building and they were not kind of doing anything. Then they started telling me what had happened, and they told me about being taken as sex slaves by ISIS fighters and taken to this place called Galaxy Cinema, which was like a market where they were sort of divided between ugly and beautiful, and fighters would come and touch their hair, touch their breasts, and decide which one that they wanted to take. I'd never heard such stories. I was horrified. And around the same time, I was going a lot to northern Nigeria, because you might remember the Chibok girls that were abducted in 2014 from their school in the middle of the night. And the whole sort of world's media descended on that for a couple of weeks, and then, as usual, kind of forgot. And so I traveled in northern Nigeria and discovered that actually tens of thousands of girls were being abducted by Boko Haram fighters and forced to be their bushwives. And so actually the Chibok girls were just the tip of the iceberg. And about 3 years after that, 2017, I was in Bangladesh when the Rohingya women were coming over the border because their villages were being attacked by Burmese military and Buddhist militia. And they were literally coming into their villages, setting fire to their huts, killing the men and dragging women out of their huts, tying them to banana trees and gang raping them, often in front of their children. So all of these stories were horrific, and actually on a really big scale. I mean, thousands of Yazidis were taken, tens of thousands of girls in Nigeria. The Rohingya, 700,000 people crossed that border in 3 months. Majority were women and children. Every woman seemed to have the same story. So I just couldn't understand how this was happening on such a scale. And we knew about it because the people were telling the stories, and it's, you know, very hard for people to talk about these issues. And yet nothing was happening. So that's why I started looking into it, just really to try and understand.
This is what's really crazy. It's happening now. As in, right now, these women in this day and age are being so brutalized, and so I can't myself. I'm reading through your book, and it's quite traumatic, your book, listening to the details these women are going through. And like I said, it's now, right now, this is happening.
No, absolutely. I mean, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say there's an epidemic of this. I mean, I wrote about 12 different countries on 5 different continents in detail, but frankly, I could have spent the rest of my life, I think, doing this, because it's happening in so many places. And even just as we speak, as you say, in the detention centers in Belarus, women are being raped. In the Uyghur detention centers in China, Uyghurs are being sexually abused. It's being used against Eritrean women by Ethiopian troops. You know, it's in Afghanistan, some of the Taliban have been taking women and girls. So, you know, it's just sort of everywhere you look, it's being used. Some people will say, as they said to me when I said I was going to write about it, that, oh, well, there's always been rape in war. And if you go back to sort of early histories by Herodotus, or the Iliad starts with a argument between Agamemnon and Achilles over an abducted woman. But that doesn't mean that in 2021, this is still somehow acceptable. I think it's just outrageous that it is happening at all, let alone on the scale that it's happening, and that no one really seems to be doing anything about it.
Well, the really interesting thing is you actually interviewed every single woman that you've got mentioned in your book. You interviewed every single one, didn't you?
Yes, I did. I mean, initially, I thought, because sometimes it's more powerful, you know, just focusing on a few people, but I wanted to give a sense of the scale of this. So I actually talked to a lot of women and told their stories, and, you know, really, really difficult for them, of course, to talk about what happened. Some found it too difficult and stopped, and that was fine. Others really wanted to tell their stories.
I found, for me, out of all of this, I think probably the Rwandan chapter was one of the most horrific, because we talk about genocide. Obviously, there's a couple of others where we talk about genocide, but for me, Rwanda's always been the one that, I mean, I was very young when Rwanda happened. I must have been about 6 or 7 years old when it was happening, and it's happened in 1994. I mean, that is not that long ago.
No,
1994.
absolutely.
And you talk to these amazing women. I think it's Serafina, Cecile. I mean, you've also got photographs of these women, and I would highly advise people to go and have a look at these photographs. They're so powerful. Once you realize what these women have gone through, and they're so brave, they have these very strong features and strong faces. And I personally can't imagine. I just cannot imagine what they went through.
Well, yeah, I think, you know, people often, when they think about Rwanda, they think about genocide and, you know, 800,000, maybe as many as 1 million people killed in the space of 100 days. And that is a faster rate than even happened under the Nazis. But at the same time, there were huge numbers of rapes. The UN estimate between 250 and 500,000 women were raped. That's a huge number of people. And of all ages, from the age of 2 to the age of 80. And this wasn't really, I mean, one of the issues that happens is at the end of conflicts, this seems to be something that people don't really discuss, that is often regarded as somehow as a side issue. So when the initial tribunal was set up to look at what had happened in Rwanda and to bring people to justice, this wasn't a feature of it at all, sexual violence or rape, even though it had happened on such a scale. And what actually happened was that one of the women testifying in the first case, which was against a mayor called Jean-Paul Akayesu, started recounting how she had climbed up a tree with her 6-year-old daughter to flee these men, and that her daughter had been raped by 3 men. And so there were 3 international judges, 2 men and a woman. One of the men literally said, well, we're not interested in that, moving on. And fortunately, there was a female judge called Navi Pillay from South Africa. And she said, hang on a minute, this woman has made all the effort to come here and let's at least hear her story. And so she asked about the rape. And this woman said, well, lots of women were being raped. And in the end, it led them to kind of suspend the case and start investigating this, and then launch the case all over again, this time with the sexual violence as one of the charges. And some very brave women, so Serafina and her sister Victoire, Cecile, were among 5 women that bravely went to Arusha and testified. I mean, they risked their life to do so because, of course, a lot of the people that had done these things were still around and were very unhappy about anybody testifying about it. So they were incredibly brave.
Wasn't it Godelieve whose husband went to testify and then he ended up getting killed while
That's
he was
right.
testifying?
Godelieve, her husband and son were both murdered. So, I mean, that brings home the risks that these women were taking. Really incredibly, these are uneducated women, but incredibly strong. And they were the first. This was actually, I think people often don't realize, I certainly didn't realize that, because a lot of people, I think, associate justice over sexual violence with Bosnia, but actually the very first case to be successfully prosecuted of rape as a war crime was this case in Rwanda, and it was only in 1998, so it's pretty recent. And the sad thing is, when you go back and talk to these women who, really changed legal history, these simple women from a small town in Rwanda, still living in miserable conditions, in huts without electricity, scrabbling to make a living. And they can't understand why all this is still going on, because they think we actually did something to stop this happening, and yet we keep hearing about it happening more and more. So they find it baffling. And to me, I mean, my book, I know, is quite difficult to read because a lot of the stories are truly terrible, but it also has some incredible heroes, and these women are certainly among them.
I really hope that your book could change something in what's happening nowadays. There's always a wishful hope at this stage, though, isn't there?
Well, that's why I wrote it, because, as I said, I was angry, and it also became very clear that justice is an exception, not the rule in this. Despite this precedent of the Rwandans, that even today, very, very few cases are brought to justice. Not a single person has been successfully prosecuted for what happened to the Yazidi girls. Not a single person has been brought to justice in Nigeria for what they did to the girls there, nor any of the Rohingyan women have. And every woman I spoke to and interviewed around the world for this book all said to me what they most wanted was justice, so that it didn't happen to other people.
It's very interesting. I want to talk a little bit about the trauma that you've experienced writing this book, because you must have experienced some sort of trauma. But there's a quote, if I'm going to try and get this right in my head. I think it was Serafina. It might have been, or maybe it might have been Cecile. One of the ladies that you interviewed in Rwanda. She said to you something along the lines of, "If you could just imagine having to lay and go through all of this, wouldn't you kind of be numb by the end of it all?" Something along those lines, that kind of quotation about being completely and utterly numb by the end of it, by being raped continuously over and over. And one of the girls, I can't remember, she was raped something like 6 or 7 times in one day, and she physically couldn't walk. I mean, it's just unimaginable. I mean, how did you manage to deal with this sort of trauma and listening to these specific kind of stories?
So this was by far the hardest book I've ever written. It was really hard to listen to these stories, to write them, but nothing compares to what it was for those women to tell their stories, and indeed, to have actually gone through this. And this is why I think people need to understand the importance of justice here, because some people seem to see this as something less important than the killing and torture in wars and conflicts. But for these women, they will say that they would rather have died than survived. It was so terrible to go through this and to live with it afterwards. And one of the tragedies here is that rape anywhere is the only crime really where the victim is often made to feel that they did something wrong. And so these women in many of these places are being ostracized from their community, stigmatized that they somehow have brought shame on their community and forced to flee. So not only have they gone through often terrible physical damage, then the emotional trauma, then sometimes they're left in economic terrible situation that they can't make a living because they've been forced to flee where they live, and that nobody wants them where they are. So, they're kind of victims over and over again. And so apart from the real need for bringing justice, the other real need is that community leaders, faith leaders, other people in positions like that, make it very clear that these women have done nothing wrong, that they are actually as one very far-sighted leader in Bangladesh said, that actually they are the heroes and we should be recognizing them as such, not castigating them.
It's very interesting. You're making my history brain kind of tick over, thinking how much more rape has been going on in history that we truly don't know how horrific it was. For example, the women who were forced to be prostitutes in concentration camps, or the Korean women who were forced to be prostitutes and sexual slaves for the Japanese in the Second World War. I mean, how much of this stuff do we truly not know about, and the experiences of these women and how much shame they had to live in post these events?
I think it's really interesting. I mean, a lot of it hasn't come out. Now, I don't know whether that has been that military historians have tended to be male, so have been less interested. And I mean, even, what happened in Germany at the end of the Second World War, when, we now think as many as 2 million German women were raped by the Soviet forces. That just didn't come out in an issue at all, and yet it happened on a large scale in, as you say, in the concentration camps. I think some people also think, oh, well, this is something that happens far away in African villages, or no, this happens all over the place. It happened in Bosnia, in Central Europe, only 30 years ago. It can happen anywhere. So I think we need to be looking at what's causing it to be used. And I particularly focused on the use of rape as a weapon of war, where people were actually kind of ordered to go and rape women. So it wasn't just something that happened in the chaos of war and the breakdown of law and order, but something where people were specifically told, go and rape women.
The very interesting thing is that if I'm not mistaken, it was in Rwanda, the Rwandan one that you did, where you didn't just interview women, you also interviewed men. And I just want to bring that reason to light, why you didn't just interview the women, that there were men also interviewed, and why.
Well, of course, once you start researching and talking to people about this issue, it does make you start to wonder, what is it, woman to a banana tree and raping her in front of her baby? I mean, this isn't about sexual enjoyment. What is it about? And is it something, would all men, if they were in these situations be doing it? Why weren't men, these cases, they were ordered to do it, but why didn't they refuse? Or why sometimes they were in positions in the middle of nowhere? Who would have known if they hadn't carried out those orders? So I wanted to try and understand that. So there seems to have not been very much research, I would say, on perpetrators. It probably should be a whole book. It would have been hard for a man to write my book talking to men about this. And in the same way, probably a book about the male perpetrators needs to be written by a man, because my own experience talking to a few perpetrators wasn't really very successful. I mean, they kept sort of saying that other people, like their cousins, had done it rather than them.
I'm sorry, they were just kind of bypassing this whole, I just don't understand why people just can't admit what they did. Just face the fact, I did it. I raped her 20 times, you know, I raped a child. But then it's also embarrassment on their side, though, and talking to a woman especially.
Yeah, I think so. And the fact is, I mean, one militia did say this to me, you know, that this is a very effective weapon, though. This is one of the problems. And if you want to clear an area to take it over, you want to wreak revenge on a community or humiliate them, raping the women and children is a very effective way of doing it. So, and as he said, it's cheaper than a Kalashnikov bullet. So I think this is the problem. It is effective. It is not only cheap in terms of cost, but also there's no penalty being paid afterwards. People, as I said, are very rarely being brought to justice for this.
Christina, thank you so much for joining me. That was so enlightening. And ladies and gentlemen, please make sure you grab yourself a copy of Christina's book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield. Again, thank you so much for this. It's been absolutely terrifying, horrific, but also, like I said, very enlightening.
Thank you for being interested.